Well, I think there are three important ideas to understand about this study and then generally about cohabitation and what it means for society today. So the first is cohabitation is incredibly common, right? Like when my grandparents turned 20 and through their 20s and 30s, they were much more likely to marry and they saw that as a marker of adulthood. But nowadays, people don't think about marriage as a marker of adulthood. You think about education, you think about forming your career. And so suddenly the need to marry to show that you're an adult to other people is gone. And what people do instead is they form these cohabiting unions with their partners. And these are likely to be shorter and less stable over time. And so that's, interesting, and we're open to learning more about that. But what we were really wondering in this study is what the long-term implications were. So I was lucky enough to partner with two certified public accountants, and one of them has a PhD as well, and the other one is getting their PhD. And we wanted to know, what would financial planners tell cohabitors? So all of the original research that was done by economists about wealth accrual over time really compared married people and single people, and they left cohabitors out of the discussion. But we know that it's common, so we want to know if it matters. And the second point is cohabitation does matter for your long-term wealth accrual. And what we find is these millennials who are now in their early 30s, they are choosing, 2/3 of them are choosing to cohabit, so it's incredibly common, but they're also choosing to not save money in the same way that they used to, that our grandparents might have or our parents might have. And this has long-term implications for what Medicaid and Medicare are going to look like, what retirement is going to look like, the sort of services we'll need. So as cohabitation has come to replace marriage or at least postpone marriage, we really aren't sure what this will mean down the road when these people who are now 30 turn 60, turn 70, and we have to start thinking about the cost to society and what that might look like. So we found that if you've ever cohabited, you do save less money. And then for each additional, it's kind of exponential. It just keeps growing. So two people who've cohabited twice save less than people who've cohabited once. Even if you cohabit and then marry, regardless of what your current status is, if you've ever cohabited, you have less money saved. So we were really curious as why that might happen. And we broke out the type of long-term financial assets that you might accrue. And we looked at, total net worth, we looked at financial, and we looked at non-financial assets. And we found that there is a place where cohabitors do tend to spend a lot of money, and that's in these non-financial assets, particularly furniture and things like this. So there might be furniture, decorations, each new partner that they're forming a relationship with, they might create a nice home together. Now, they're not buying a home together as often as a married couple, but they're filling that home. And so there's a lot of money in the right here, right now consumption, and not a lot of forward thinking about long-term consumption. So as we're looking at these results, we say, okay, there's a couple things we can do. We're not going to stop the floodgate of cohabitation. It's here. We now have to think about what are practical ways to respond to what's real today in terms of our family relationships. And so one thing that we've advocated for, very specifically for financial planners, is that they sit down with people and talk about what their relationships are. So often that's really not part of the discussion. And we need to say, well, you're not just single or married, you might be cohabiting, and that is very different, as you'll see in the paper, from long-term single or long-term married. And what does that look like? Because there needs to be more wealth training for people who are in these relationships. We also suggest that we need to change some of our laws and policies. Most states, well, every state have arrangements in their laws for how we deal with relationships that end when you're married. And it's usually a 50-50 split of the assets. But states are different in terms of cohabitation, and the most common thing is there isn't a rule that splits it 50-50. So if I were married and then dissolved my relationship and my partner and I had bought a boat together, we would each get 50-50 of the boat at the end of the day. If we were cohabiting, even if we cohabited for the same amount of time, the same partner, everything's the same, but we're just not married, if we dissolve that relationship, then it's whoever wrote the check gets to keep the boat. And so people, it's very rational that they don't want to invest together in these long-term things because there's more risk. You don't know what you'll get out of it when the relationship ends. And so we need to make it less rational for people to avoid savings. And part of the way that we can do that is we're recommending doing things very similar to prenuptial agreements, but do it for cohabitations. So before you start your relationship, define how the assets will be split, make it formal, understand what will happen at the end, and then really work together to this joint, to grow your wealth together. And then know that it will split and it's more, it'll be more of a rational decision to save in the long run. And we think that will really actually help society. So beyond just being supportive and this is a normal behavior and responding to it as a normal behavior, it will also be really good for our public programs and for our long-term economic viability as a country.